So a family member asked me recently why I got into fantasy, why I got into Dungeons and Dragons. I told them I didn't have an answer. And the reason why I didn't have an answer is because I never stopped being into fantasy. I never stopped playing Dungeons and Dragons. In fact, I created a gang of fantasy stories myself, of my own. And after an extended break, I'm back to playing Dungeons and Dragons. It's not a phase that I came into. It's not a phase I went through. It's just part of what I do. It just is. And if you're watching this video, it's a good chance that you're like that as well. We all do this. Cope. Fantasy is how we cope. Fantasy is how we cope. But here's the question that I couldn't answer for my family member, and maybe you can't answer it for yourself. Why does fantasy work the way that it does? Why do we keep coming back to the same emotional pattern again and again? Because that pattern didn't come from nowhere. It came from one man. What we're all coping with isn't our trauma, it's his. So every fantasy story follows the same arc. You fall in love with a found family, a cohort, a group of people, and then they break up. The mentor dies. The trusted friend betrays. Everything falls apart. The hero loses everything. Not just externally, but internally as well. Complete, total despair. And then when there's no reason for it, salvation comes. Providence comes, almost as if it's sort of like Deus ex machina. It's sort of like a blessing. The eagles come. The armies show up. The magic works. The prophecy fulfills. So Games of Thrones does it. Harry Potter does it. The Wheel of Time does it. Every D&D campaign does it. You know this whole pattern yourself, and you don't even think about it because you're usually going through it when you're in fantasy. It's just sort of like how fantasy feels. But that feeling, that specific feeling, that emotional architecture, it has a source. The source is trauma. It's 1916 and J.R.R. Tolkien is 24 years old. He's a signals officer in the British Army at the Battle of the Somme. His job is maintaining communication between units in the trenches, which means he's close enough to the killing to coordinate it, but just separated enough to survive it. He's relaying orders, tracking positions, listening to voices go silent. So he watches his closest homies die. Jeffrey Smith, Robert Gilson, the men he shared everything with, they're no longer with him. He catches trench fever, gets sent home, survives, and then he has to figure out how to keep living in a world where that happened, where everyone who mattered just stopped existing, where there was no reason, no meaning, no logic to who lived and who didn't. So he created one. He called it catastrophe, the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, the moment when against all odds, against all reason, hope breaks through absolute despair. Not because it's dramatically satisfying, because he needed it to be true. His brain needed to believe that surviving meant something, that there was grace in the horror. Here's what happened next. Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings. Then he encoded catastrophe into the fabric of his story. Gandalf falls. Fellowship breaks. Boromir dies. Frodo loses himself at Mount Doom. Frodo loses himself at Mount Doom. Every moment of despair is absolute, complete, hopeless. Then the eagles, the army of the dead, Golems fall, carrying Frodo up the mountain. Catastrophe over and over again. Every fantasy writer after Tolkien observed the same pattern. Followed the same pattern. Not consciously, not deliberately, but they did. Felt it work. They saw how the readers responded to it. You've seen since he put out his seminal books, The Hobbit and LOTR, have been a replication of what he created. Every fantasy writer absorbed the Tolkien pattern. They replicated it. Every fantasy novel, every D&D campaign, epic you've ever consumed. You're not experiencing your story when you read fantasy. You're experiencing his, practicing his coping mechanism, running his trauma response for your nervous system, and you're calling it entertainment. It's therapy, but it's just not therapy for you. About the last fantasy story you saw, and think about why it hits you hard. Try to conceptualize what changed around for you. What gave you hope again? What made you believe? Or in fact, what was that moment when it seemed like the hero lost everything? That moment when the hero couldn't see any other way forward? It wasn't just a story beat. In 16, that's Somme. That's what a 24-year-old signals officer needed to believe to survive watching his friends die for nothing. And you needed it too. But here's what you can't answer. Like I couldn't answer my family member. Why? Why do you need it? Why can't you stop? Why can't you stop watching? Why does every fantasy story follow the same pattern? You're not just reading fantasy for fun, just playing D&D because it's entertaining. You're dosing yourself with someone else's survival mechanism over and over and over again. Can't stop. Tolkien didn't just influence fantasy, it made you dependent on it, just like people used to be dependent on China white.